Hi everyone and welcome. I'm here today in Moultrie, Georgia with Mr. Sam Watson with Chilsea Farms. So Mr. Watson, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and the farm here at Chilsea?
I'd be glad to. But first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this video. Chilsea Farms, we started in 2007. The name Chilsea, actually I have two partners, Clay Underwood and Will Grantham, and we all have two kids. And so the name Chilsea stands for Cal, Henry, Isabella, Lily, Lucy, and Cade. So that's why it's a little different. But at the time we didn't really know what we were doing. We were just having fun. But we started in 2007, and now we're up to about 500 acres of vegetable production here in Moultrie. And so that's kind of how it all began. We actually started with squash, 20 acres of squash. So it's been fun.
So since you grew squash and you've grown it for 20 years, tell us a little bit about a life of a squash plant.
So the squash is a very fast growing plant. We start with a seed in the greenhouse, and it's usually in the greenhouse for about 10 days, and then we transplant it to ground like you see behind us. And then in another 30 to 35, 40 days, depending on the weather, and if we have temperatures like this, maybe sooner, the squash will start producing. And then at that time we'll start picking squash. And a lot of times you have to pick squash every single day because you want to get the size right. And they grow really fast. So in about 35 to 45 days you can be picking squash from the time you plant a seed in the greenhouse to the time it's ready for harvest.
And I know on a squash plant the male flowers and the female flowers are a little different. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why they differ?
So they're very important to the process, and so probably the biggest thing about it is we have to use honeybees, and the honeybees have to pollinate the female flower. Well, they obtain the pollen from the male flower. So you have female blooms and you have male blooms on the squash plant. And so what the bees do is they transfer that pollen from the male flower to the female flower. And that's so important because not only does that at the end of the day decide what that fruit will look like, but it makes that fruit viable and allows that plant to keep making. So it makes the shape correct, and then it keeps the plant going.
And with harvesting squash plants, how is that done?
So once we start harvesting, all the squash that we harvest is done by hand. It's picked in buckets and then transferred into bins that are in the field, and those bins are carried to the packing house. At that point they're all inspected, all of the squash is washed and sanitized, and then it's graded out and put into different sizes and different grades in the different boxes, and then it's put on pallets. It's pre-cooled in the cooler and tagged, and then put on a truck, and then after that you'll find it on the shelf in the grocery store.
And you're talking about grades. Will you explain a little bit more about what you mean by the grades of the squash?
So we pack a fancy squash, we pack a medium squash, and we pack a large squash. Mm-hmm. Your fancy squash is going to be what you see on the grocery store shelf. That's the real small, pretty squash. The medium squash is going to have a little more size to it. It's going to be a little bit bigger. It's going to be more of your food service type squash. It's just going to feed more people. Same with large. It's just going to be bigger than a medium, and it's going to feed that many more people, and it's cheap usually. And so a lot of our restaurants use the medium and the large just because it's cheap and it goes further.
And so what kind of situation do you have? What challenges do you face on a farm like this?
Well, a lot of our challenges are like everybody else. You know, we continue to have increasing input costs is probably our biggest thing, and it doesn't matter whether it's labor or seed, fertilizer, chemicals. Our input costs on the farm continue to go up, but yet we're selling the products for the same price that we sold them for many years ago. And of course the customer and the retailer and the consumer doesn't know that, but it's getting harder and harder for us, the farmers, to continue to do what we do because it's costing more and more, but yet the price we receive for the products we grow and produce stays the same or is going down in some situations.
So what is one thing that you would tell a consumer about Georgia agriculture or squash?
So first thing is I would tell the consumer to eat lots of squash, number one, and then number two, make sure it's Georgia grown or American grown. But other than that, that's the biggest thing. Just when you go to the store, look at the labels, read the labels, make sure that it's American grown or Georgia grown, and help support the farmers here in our state and across the country.
And our last question is a little fun. What is your favorite thing to do with squash?
My favorite thing to do with squash, well, squash is good fried. Squash is good in a casserole. Squash is good sauteed. I had some sauteed last night, matter of fact, some zucchinis. So there's lots of different ways to cook squash, and we grow lots of it. So if you mess up, we got plenty more. So it's healthy, it's good, and I always enjoy to eat it. But probably the best thing I like to do with it is put it in a box and sell it. But other than that, that's about it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sam, for giving us all this information about squash plants. I know that I learned so much today about squash, and I hope you all did as well. I want to thank Chilsea Farms and Mr. Sam for having us today, and we hope you have a great season.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say one other thing too,
yes.
that with all this going on in the world today, I just want the consumer to know that the farmer is still out there doing what they need to do. About the only thing we worry about is the weather, but I want them to know that we're going to keep doing what we do. We're going to keep growing squash. We're going to keep growing whatever we're growing to make sure that they have it on the grocery store shelf, and that it's good and that it's safe, and just want to make sure they know that.
Well, thank you. I know I appreciate that as a consumer. That is awesome that farmers are still doing that today, and that they're continuing doing their legacy. So I appreciate it, and thank you again.
All right.